Hi, everyone. Daniel Gilbert, Chief Operating Officer at Kite Technology Group, here today to share with you what is, in my opinion, one of the most powerful and yet most underused features in Microsoft Excel. Excel is great for storing data and for doing calculations and a lot of things you may be familiar with. But the feature that I want to show you is pivot charts and pivot tables, which can help you take data that you have and show you trends and patterns and things that you might not see otherwise. So let's get started. So the place to start is getting some data to work with. You need to have data to create tables and charts from. And that's the most challenging part, maybe for some of you, is how do you get data? You probably use a line of business app in your company. And the first place to start is how do you get data out of that app into Excel or CSV format? And it's different for every application. So I won't be able to advise you on how here, but once you have data in Excel or CSV format, then you can take it the next step and create pivot tables with it. Here's some sample data that I have that I'm going to work with. And let me show you a few things about the data that's going to be important. Once you have it in Excel, there's a few things you'll want to do first. First of all, make sure that you have column headers on all of your columns. So I have ID, employee name, type of work, etc., that describe what that column contains. And also I have each column formatted based on what kind of information is in that column. So if you'll notice up here in the formatting area, I have some text fields. I have some number fields. This is a date field. This is a time field, another number field, and another text field. So whatever your data contains, make sure that it's formatted properly because that can come into play later. All right, so once you have your data the way it needs to look, then you can take it and create a pivot table. So the way you do that is that you go up to the Insert tab and click Pivot Table. You can click this icon. There are also options under the drop-down menu. Excel allows you to connect to other sources for data. For our purposes, we're using data that's already in Excel. That's the simplest way. So you either select the icon or you just select table from table/range. And it recognizes you have data and usually does a good job of highlighting all that data. If it doesn't, you can always manually click and drag to select your data. Since I started, I'm just going to go all the way down. I have 1,000 records in this sample data. If your data is all contiguous, meaning that there are no blank columns or blank rows, then Excel will properly recognize the entire range that you have selected as long as your cell, you have selected one of the cells in that table. And the other option that you get is whether you want to add the pivot table on a new worksheet or existing worksheet. The default is new worksheet. I'm going to keep that so that we get a separate screen to work with. So then you can click OK. And we have our pivot table dialog box. Now that we have the pivot table created, we're going to start working with it. So I created an example here. The sample data that I'm using is time entries for a handful of employees that work at a chain of bars. And so I just put an example up here. I find it useful to write down what the example is that I'm looking for, because typically when you're doing these kinds of things, you have an idea in mind, or you have a question you want to answer, or a hunch that you have. So I find it useful to write up at the top, what are the questions that we're trying to answer? So in this case, I want to know how many hours did each of my employee work, and at which locations are those hours being spent? So those are the questions we're going to answer. By the way, if you lose your dialog box over here, like I just did, you can click inside this pivot table area and it comes right back. So how do we go about building the pivot table to answer these questions? Well, the place I like to start every time is with the values area. We're going to be dragging these fields down into these areas. I always like to start with the values area, which is defining what the number is that you're actually measuring. So in this case, it's hours. How many hours is each of my employee working? So I'm going to take my hours spent field and drag it into the values area. You'll notice that it defaults to sum, which in this case is what I want. And then if we look over here to the table area, it is showing the sum of all the data, and it's a total of 610.4 hours across all of it. That isn't what the answer I'm looking for quite yet, but that's the first step. Next, I need to break this down by employee. The way I do that is to drag the employee name field into the rows area, and right away it breaks out all of the employees and sums up the number of hours they worked in total. So already we can start to make some conclusions, like Cricket has the most number of hours and Bruce has the least. Maybe that's useful at this point. So the next question, at which locations are these hours being spent? I'm going to leave the rows showing the employees, but I'm going to add in the columns to show me the locations. So I'm going to take the location field, drag that into columns. So now we have 2 dimensions showing me all the employees and how many hours each of them worked at each of my locations. So this answers effectively both questions. And I can look into this and start making some inferences depending on what I want to know. Like, hey, look at this. Nikki is spending most of her time at the South Philly location, which also happens to be the location where the most number of hours is being spent in total. So the data is shown to you however you have defined it to be sliced up. Let's say I don't care about the employees anymore. I just want to know how many hours are being worked at each location. Well, I already get that here in this view. If you just look at the grand total row down here, it totals them all up for each location. But just to play around, I'm going to drag location. I'm just going to get rid of employee name. So here's a useful tip. If you drag your fields, you want to get rid of them, you can just drop them in the white space over here and it takes them out of your table. So now it's showing me just the number of hours by location. If I'm not comfortable with that view, maybe I want it to be on the rows instead. I can drag that over here and it changes the way it's displayed. So very versatile in how you can use these fields and drag them around to show you the information that you want to see. Let's do one more example. Here's the other example we're going to be working with, customer satisfaction scores. So in my hypothetical data, every time an employee puts in a time entry, they get scored on how satisfied their customers were. So we're going to look at what are the customer satisfaction scores across employees, which employee has the best satisfaction score, and which location has the best satisfaction score. So same kind of thing. We're going to drag, again, start with values is the way I like to do it. So we'll take the CSAT score field and drag it under values. And we're going to start with employees. I'm going to take the employee name again and drag it onto rows. So it breaks up the data again. You may have already noticed that, again, it defaulted to sum. In this case, it's a CSAT score that goes 1 to 10, 1 being unsatisfied and 10 being completely satisfied. The sum doesn't really tell us anything. We care more about the average. So in order to get this to give us the average customer satisfaction score, we'll click here on this drop down, go to value field settings, and instead of sum, we'll choose average. Also, while I'm in here, I don't care about seeing all those decimal points. Maybe I just want to see 1 decimal point. So it's also in here and under number format. You go to number, and then I want to see, what did we say? Just 1 decimal point. Okay, and let's click OK and see what that does. So now I've got the average of CSAT score, which is more meaningful than summing up the CSAT score. And already I can start to see answers to my first question. So who has the best? That's Cricket with 8.9. He's doing a terrific job. On the other hand, some of these lower ones, Maureen with 2.4 and Schmitty with 2.7, probably need some work. The other question here is locations. So again, depending on how you want to see the data, just like with our last example, I'll drag location on to the columns so we can see that. And it's a lot of data. It's a little overwhelming to just look at here. So let's take employee name out again and drag location over to rows. And we can see, yeah, it's pretty consistent. And the grand total row down here calculates based on whatever you have chosen for your summarizing of data. In this case, we've chosen average instead of sum, so it gives us the average down here. So not too different based on location. Just one more point on pivot tables before we switch over and I show you pivot charts. I could take those first two examples I did and combine them. So I put up here, show me hours worked and CSAT scores for all employees. And I just want to show you that quickly because you can measure multiple things if you're using the same dimension. So again, start with values. I want hours worked, hours spent. Sum is good. And I want CSAT score. So we'll go through this again. CSAT score. No, I don't want sum. I want average. And I want no decimals. 1 decimal. And now I have both. And if I drag employee name to rows, then you can see all the employees and multiple different values that we're measuring. Keep in mind when you do this with multiple different things that you're measuring for, you can't break it out as quite as easily by column. So if you want to cross-reference 2 dimensions, you can do that. But it's a lot more complicated when you try to do that and you're measuring multiple different values. So here's a nice way to be able to see both of those measures that we took in the same view. Now that I've shown you some basic examples of using pivot tables, I want to move over to pivot charts, which are really very similar and they work in almost exactly the same way. But pivot charts are used for visualizing data in a graph format. So I've gotten rid of our pivot table examples. I'm back at our data now, and we create a pivot chart the same way you created a pivot table. Select inside your data somewhere, go to the Insert tab, and instead of pivot table over here, pivot chart is way over here. So I'm going to click pivot chart. Similar dialog box here. I'm not going to change anything, and I'll click OK. And we've got our pivot chart. Looks very similar already to the way the pivot table looked, only now you have this area in the middle that is going to show the visualization of your data. Just to keep things simple here, I brought back our first example. How many hours is each employee working and at which locations are those hours being spent? And the first thing I want to do is draw your attention over to the areas which look a little bit different for pivot charts than they do for pivot tables. They're just named a little bit differently, but essentially do pretty much the same thing. Instead of columns, you see legend, and instead of rows, you see axis, but you'll see that they work in a similar way. So let's get started. I'm going to start with my values area, and what we're measuring here is hours. So hours spent goes under values. It defaults to sum, which again is good for this measure. And you can see that it already chose a bar chart for us. And for this example, I think a bar chart is probably going to be good because we're comparing employees to each other. So then in order to get the employees, to get it broken out into employees, let's see what happens when we drag employee name under axis. And so we can see all of our employees and bars that represent the total number of hours they work. So this view is much easier to see who are the big time workers, Cricket and Nikki, way up there in the 50s. and who have the smallest bars. Bruce here is sub 20. So this way we can see a visual representation of how much each of the employees is working. But we're not done yet. We have one other question to answer. At which locations are these hours being spent? I'm going to show you a couple ways that you can get this data in different views. You can, either way, it's going to involve taking the location field. And first, I'm going to drag it onto legend so that you can see what that does. So it puts multiple bars for each employee and color codes them. And you can see the legend over here. It tells you which bar color corresponds to which location. So maybe that view is useful for you. This is a quick way to see Artemis is spending most of her time at East Philly and almost none of her time at West Philly. Compare that to someone like Schmitty over here, who is spending very little time at East Philly and a lot more time at West Philly. And the other way I want to show the data is by changing the chart type. So to do that, I came up here to the ribbon where there are these extra tabs over here when you're working with pivot charts and pivot tables. So if you go to the design tab, you have the option to change your chart type. I'm going to do that to show the data in a different way. You can see there are tons of different kinds of charts you can use. I'm still going to use a column chart for this, but instead I'm going to use a stacked column chart. And if I click OK, then you can see what happens is that it stacks all those bars on top of each other instead of putting them next to each other. So you can still see in total who has the biggest bars. And then within those bars, you can see how they're broken down. I have one more example I want to walk through using pivot charts. So the questions that I wrote down are how much work is being done at different times of the day and what types of work are being done at different times of the day. So we'll get to see a couple fields we haven't used yet. But first one is one we're familiar with. How much work is being done? We're going to measure by the number of hours spent. And we're asking at different times of the day. So we're going to use the time field and drag that under axis. And by default, it will break that time field out by whole hours. So we can see almost all the work is being done between the hours of 7 a.m. and 5 p.m. And then we see a spike here in the middle of the night at midnight. So there may be something interesting to see there. So the other question is what types of work are being done at different times of the day? Now there's a lot of ways using pivot charts and pivot tables to see information in different ways. I'm going to show you using a feature I haven't shown yet, which is called a slicer. And a slicer allows you to have a control on your screen where you can click down through different values that are in your data and see the data filtered out by those values. So I'm going to go to pivot chart, analyze, and click insert slicer. And the slicer, the field I'm going to use for my slicer is type of work, because that is what the question's asking. So type of work, click OK. When it comes up, it's already got an option selected. It's got bartender selected. So it adjusted the data to show us that. And you'll notice that that 12 o'clock bar that was big is now gone. So there's no bartending being done at 12 o'clock. Let's just page down here and see if we can find what we're looking for. Okay, here is all of that work that's being done at 12 o'clock. Inventory. So all the inventory work is being done at midnight because we don't see any other bars here at any other time of the day. So the slicer helped us find that trend. There's also this little button on the slicer that allows you to multi-select. So if you wanted to have it be able to select multiple different types of work like bartender and server, for example, and let's unselect inventory, then you can use the slicer to select multiple pieces of data at the same time. And you can click this other button and it clears the filter and it shows you everything again. So now we're done all our examples, but I just wanted to show you a couple other things here in the pivot table analyze menu that may be useful when you're working with pivot tables. Right here in the data section, there's a refresh button. So if any of your values in your data get changed for whatever reason, you update them manually or somehow they change, you'll need to click the refresh button to tell your pivot table to go and pull the new data. It won't pull the new data automatically. You have to click the refresh button. And the other one is change data source. So if you're, let's say you add columns or rows to your data, you need to tell your pivot table to go and look for that new column. So I added a column. So let's show you what that looks like. Change data source. You can see the dotted lines are not around the pay status field, which is the new field I added. So we're going to just go ahead and select it all, and we've got to scroll all the way down to the bottom. And now that's included. We click OK, and we can see the pay status field show up here. So that will be a needed step if you add a column or if you add rows, or if you take out columns or rows. You'd use the change data source button to adjust the data that your table is looking at. All right, well, that's our show. Thanks for watching. So what we've covered here is just the basics. Again, if you know the basics and you know how to create and work with a pivot table, I think that you've really unlocked a very powerful tool that will allow you to get insight to your data that you didn't have before. So there are a lot of more advanced features in pivot tables and pivot charts that you can play around with on your own and see what's there. We may even cover some of those topics in future videos if there's enough interest. So again, thanks for watching. If you have any questions or comments, feel free, as always, to reach out to Kite Tech. We're here and happy to answer your questions. All right, take care, everyone. Bye.